Hello, everyone. Father Jared coming to you again. So as I mentioned last time, I'm changing up a little bit how I do these videos. And so what I'm going to talk about in this video is going to be really the first part of a 3-part series. So some of you who know Lord of the Rings may know that although J.R.R. Tolkien did not very much like metaphor or direct allegory, he nonetheless did very much write Lord of the Rings as a Catholic work, and he intended it to be, as such, representative of a number of things within the Catholic faith. And one of the things that people have noticed, I'm not real sure if Tolkien himself ever identified this, but it appears that 3 of the primary protagonists in the story, Frodo, Aragorn, and Gandalf, all represent the 3 parts, the threefold identity of Christ, and Frodo in his priesthood, and Aragorn in his role as king, and Gandalf in his role as prophet. So priest, prophet, and king. So seeing that instead of having one person represent Jesus as what C.S. Lewis does in his Chronicles of Narnia, instead what Tolkien does is he kind of makes the identities of Christ representative in 3 protagonists who are not perfect representations of Christ, right? So again, not direct allegory or metaphor, because although they bear parts of these identities that we see within Jesus, they ultimately are not representative of him perfectly, because each of them is a flawed character, even though Tolkien's characters, as a rule, are oftentimes much more heroic and virtuous than what we typically see in stories today. But nonetheless, they are not perfect representations. So starting with that, how I would like to connect that to a 3-part series is, instead of merely looking at the different rules of Christ in priest, prophet, and king as they're found there, but instead to look at really what we see when we look at the person of Christ as the ideal man, and especially in masculinity. Obviously, he identifies with women too, but what I think is maybe something that's difficult for us sometimes as men to really entertain and to engage with whenever it comes to Christ is, how exactly does my masculinity fit into the perfect man, right? So how do I live out my masculinity as a man called to be like Christ? And so instead of merely looking at Frodo, Gandalf, and Aragorn as representative of Christ, I instead want to look at each of their respective masculinities to see what we can glean and to see how we can find in them as men, especially as Christian men, that we can find strength, we can find an example, and we can find a way of reading these stories to help us to better see a path forward for ourselves and how to better live out our masculinity, to be men of service, to be men that are leaders, to be men that speak prophetically, right? So in looking at that, what we're going to start with is, first I want to focus on Frodo and his masculinity. And we can see, and I'll try to timestamp it so that way you can jump to this part if you like, in the description. But in looking at Frodo and his masculinity, what he ultimately bears out for us, again, he's kind of the priestly representative because he bears the burden, right? So he's the one who sacrifices, the one who is ultimately gives all in order for the ring to be destroyed, right? And in looking at this character, then we can see that is where I first want to start. Is there's 3 different elements to his character that I want to focus on that I think are particularly relevant for being better men this day and age, being saintly men this day and age, being virtuous men this day and age. And those 3 different things are, first, sacrifice, the role of companionship or accepting help, and also healing in our response to the wounds that we receive in life, because we're all going to receive those. But the first thing is ultimately Frodo's willingness to bear his burden, to sacrifice, to give for others. And this is at first is done very naively, and we could say it's even a bit unfair that the primary prop in this Lord of the Rings is the One Ring. And Gandalf doesn't know that it's the One Ring for sure. Whenever Bilbo, gives it up, that with the help of Gandalf, Bilbo's able to let the One Ring go and pass it on to Frodo. Frodo has no idea what he's just inherited. He has no idea what he's taking on. The burden of responsibility is just accepted by receiving this as an inheritance from Bilbo. He doesn't understand that. Gandalf doesn't understand that. Bilbo doesn't understand what he just left him with. And in that, though, is also like the story of our own lives. Like we can naively, and we do naively enter into the different sacrifices and burdens we become responsible for as men. As a priest, I didn't know everything that I would have to go through as a priest. I didn't quite understand all the different burdens and responsibilities and how imperfectly, because I'd hoped that I would carry them better than I have. I didn't know how difficult it would be in some ways, but I also didn't know all the gifts. And I think that's one of the mysteries that I'm sure married men experience as well. But I think it's also something important for even men who are not, men who are not married or haven't quite gotten to their vocation yet, that there can be this naivete that like everything seems better on the other side. It seems idealized, that once I get into my vocation, then life's going to be perfect and great. It's not going to be hard. And of course, that's not true. And in a similar way, we see this happen with Frodo, that he doesn't quite understand the burden that he's carrying. He doesn't quite understand what it is and what he's going to have to go through in order to carry this burden. But eventually he does, and he just carries. And at first, the hope is that he just has to carry it to Rivendell, right? And so this is kind of like the stage of naivety. So like we take up our burden, we take upon our sacrifice, doe-eyed and bushy-tailed and all that stuff, and like ready to carry that burden. But then, like, as we recognize the difficulties that come, and Frodo quickly realizes this, that he's all of a sudden being pursued by these riders. He messes up in the prancing pony. And then it also is, stabbed by the Morgul blade, which will forever scar him, is a wound that he will feel every year on his anniversary, and a wound that almost brings him over to become a wraith like the Ringwraiths himself. But, he didn't know all that was going to happen, but he bears it heroically. And while I think we start out bearing our burdens oftentimes naively without fully understanding the full context, that doesn't mean that we don't have a choice. And I think this is where really the heroism, the true masculinity of Frodo, which is this is the basis of all the other aspects of our masculinity, is our willingness to bear our burdens, to sacrifice for the sake of others, to carry our crosses. And that is that he eventually does freely accept. And I think that's where we also have to get to. We're all probably going to get to a point in our respective vocations to where we may ask ourselves, like, is this really what I signed up for? And the answer probably is not exactly. This is not exactly what I wanted. This isn't what I asked for. But we can still choose to carry it freely. And I want to share with you so that, like in the movie, there's kind of a moment like this, but I think in the book, it does a good job of explaining what's happening, because people aren't fighting, but instead they recognize at a certain point, like Bilbo offers to take the ring, but they acknowledge Bilbo's way too old to take the ring to Mordor, but somebody needs to take it. So this is the Council of Elrond. And so they're like, well, who the heck's going to carry it? And unlike in the movie, in the book, there's no fighting that, that Legolas is going to take it. Nobody thinks that they're capable of carrying it, right? And so the entire council goes silent. The entire council acknowledges, like, we don't know what to do. And so there's silence, and nobody's like making any expectations of one another. Nobody's jumping to carry the ring. And so I want to read this part where Frodo accepts this responsibility. No one answered. The noon bell rang. Still no one spoke. Frodo glanced at all the faces, but they were not turned to him. All the council sat with downcast eyes, as if in deep thought. A great dread fell upon him, as if he was awaiting the pronouncement of some doom that he had long foreseen and vainly hoped might, after all, never be spoken. An overwhelming longing to rest and remain at peace by Bilbo's side in Rivendell filled his heart. At last, with an effort, he spoke and wondered to hear his own words, as if some other will was using his small voice. "I will take the ring," he said, "though I do not know the way." And the thing that it's a powerful moment that he, right before he makes his decision, he acknowledges his desire to be at peace, his desire to remain in a place of comfort. And I think that's where sometimes we all can find ourselves, right? Like, we just want it to be easy. We want it to not be burdensome. We want it to be ultimately something that is without difficulty. But that is not something for us to choose. And even right after this passage here, Elrond will not say that, he doesn't say, "Good, we all knew that you need to carry it," but he does say, "I think you are the one that has to carry this, but I do not lay it upon you." And I think this is, again, the reality of what we have to accept as men, is that we each do have a task. We do have a role to play. And I think sometimes that can feel like that task is being laid upon us by others, God, family, whatever it may be. But I think at the same time we have to recognize, as Elrond makes clear to Frodo, that we have a choice. And I'm not saying that because I think that we should walk away from our vocations. No, absolutely not. That is the worst thing we can do. What I'm saying, though, is that if we recognize that we have a choice, we can then freely choose it. Choose the burden that has been laid upon us without us perhaps wanting it, but we can freely choose it, and in that acceptance of our rule, there's then freedom for us to there's an acceptance that allows us to live with joy, to live in freedom, and allows the burden to thus be lighter, not because someone is forcing upon us, but because we freely take it, right? As our Lord says, take up your cross daily and follow after me. We have the choice. And if we accept the choice, then freely bearing it instead of just grudgingly carrying it, we then experience true freedom. And so I think that's the first aspect of Frodo's masculinity that is absolutely central to all manhood. Every single man has a responsibility to bear his burden well, has a burden to bear his burden better and better. And then the second part of Frodo's masculinity that I want to focus on is really his willingness to accept help, but also to keep moving forward despite perhaps a lack of help. Because I think oftentimes whenever we carry burdens, there can be a feeling that we have to do this all by ourselves. We have to have a willingness to bear the difficulties that are laid upon us, and we can make that entirely our responsibility, right? Like, I've got to grit it and I've got to do it, and I'm going to be this pioneering Lone Ranger. But that usually is not what God wants for us. Now, I think that this is also like a powerful moment in the book in which Frodo recognizes what the ring is beginning to do to the Fellowship, because in the book, right after Boromir has him, there's this interior dialogue that happens within Frodo's mind. And so I want to read that short passage from you. So, a great weariness was upon him, but his will was firm and his heart lighter. He spoke aloud to himself, "I will do now what I must. This, at least, is plain. The evil of the ring is already at work even within the company, and the ring must leave them before it does more harm. I will go alone. Some I cannot trust, and those I can trust are too dear to me. Poor old Sam and Merry and Pippin, Strider too. His heart yearns for Minas Tirith, and he will be needed there. now Boromir has fallen into evil. I will go alone at once. And so in this moment, I think we all can experience this, right? That we think we need to carry our burdens alone. And to a certain extent, then what we see but what ultimately ends up happening is that Sam, using his wit and his determination, is able to go with Frodo. So Frodo doesn't have to bear this burden alone. He still has help. He still has aid. And without Sam, Frodo would have never made it, right? And I think, and I just want to comment here that sometimes I think we attribute way too much to Sam whenever Frodo's the one who is carrying the most evil object in the world that slowly takes over your heart and he's able to resist it for years on end. So I don't think that we should discount how heroic, and I think, and Tolkien would have said this too, like Frodo is, if there is a central hero, even though Tolkien, again, doesn't like to write central heroes, he likes to point out that it takes many, 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 many different people to ultimately win the day. But Frodo is ultimately meant to be the central protagonist. And I say that just because, not because I'm trying to diminish Sam, but because while it is good for us to help one another, we also need to recognize that carrying our own burden is our responsibility, but then we also have a responsibility to help one another carry our burdens to make that burden lighter. And so I think also, as Frodo points out there too, we also have to have the people that we can trust with our burden. Burdens are not meant to be carried alone, but you'll also notice that Frodo doesn't take everyone with him. He doesn't take the whole fellowship with him after Boromir's heart turns to evil. But instead, what he does is he takes Sam with him because he can trust Sam, and Merry and Pippin then get captured and everything else that goes with that. And Aragorn must go to Minas Tirith in order for Frodo to ultimately be able to get the ring to Mount Doom. But what I think is important for us to recognize as men there is that the burdens we carry and that we help each other to carry that help has to come from trustworthy sources. Because those who are not going to want to encourage us, those who are not going to support us, those who ultimately, abandon us when the road darkens, those are not the people we want. The people who are going to set us back, the people who are going to tell us that our burden's not worth carrying, or like on the other side of it too, those who want to carry all the burden for us. And I think this is also another responsibility in accepting help, is that a mistake that I have too often fallen into is that I want somebody else to carry the burden for me, right? I want to make a friend, a family member, someone so responsible for my burden that they're effectively the ones carrying it, right? Because again, this is something that, as Elrond says, is like it's a task that is appointed to Frodo. And so while Sam does carry the ring for a very brief period, it is Frodo's responsibility. And I think that's a fair enough thing for us as well, is that we need to accept help. We also need to recognize the limits of other people's help. No one can carry what you have to carry. People can help you, they can aid you, they can support you. But we as men have to also recognize that our burdens, ours are ours. They belong to us. And as a result, we do have a responsibility to carry them, but we also need to accept the help that comes to us. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about Frodo's masculinity in this too. Like Frodo, and going by himself with the ring, and even accepting the responsibility, accepts that people are going to help him again and again and again. We see Frodo simply trust that he's going to be provided for. He trusts that Gandalf is going to lead him to Mordor. He trusts that the members of the Fellowship are going to help him to get there. He trusts that Sam is going to play his part in helping him to bear the burden of the ring. He even trusts that Gollum, despite all of his treacherous ways and his difficulties, is ultimately indispensable to them in helping them to get into Mordor. And then also we see that even like in the book in particular, that his trust of Faramir and that Faramir has their best interests at heart. And I'll probably make a video on how Faramir and Frodo are actually very similar in this. They both express humility. That they trust that ultimately providence, we would say God, trust that ultimately help is going to be given to them in time of need. And we see this even with Frodo and with Frodo's and the Fellowship's rest in Lothlorien. And so accepting that burden, accepting help to carry that burden is something absolutely central to that manhood as well, because we can't do it alone. And this is where I think men are really being sold short at this point in time, is that I see a lot of men struggle to not have real friendships. They may have drinking buddies, they may be friends with their wives, friends, husbands, but oftentimes I think I see that men really struggle to find other men that they can trust. And I think even at times they can struggle to trust their wives to help them carry their burdens. Now, obviously, I think their wives want to, but I think there's a whole host of reasons as to why men can feel guilty about wanting to work with others in terms of helping them to carry the burdens that they carry, right? Because the responsibilities of providing for one's family, of being a good father, of being a helpful member of one's community is no easy task. And so I think that is something also that is helpful. And so that's why if you're a woman watching this, that I hope you also recognize that I think men struggle to trust a lot, and that's not without reason. Many times men's trusts have been broken by other men. They've been broken by women. It's a lot that men have experienced. And again, women experience a lot too, so I'm not trying to diminish the different struggles that women may have in that. But what I'm trying to acknowledge here, trying to get at, is that ultimately we need to be willing to accept help as men and to seek out help even. Because I think we don't live in a situation in which that just kind of happens, at least anymore. I think, unfortunately, even a negative effect of kind of the negative effect of our culture on a whole, of its distrust of men, but I think even of the fact that there's this fear of being labeled gay if you have close male friends, I think a lot of it just contributes to the whole difficulty that we see in culture with accepting help from other men, because intimacy is in many ways taboo among men. And so I think that's something that we need to overcome, and I think that's something that Frodo exhibits for us rather well. And finally, the last part of Frodo's masculinity that I think is so helpful for us as men, and something that I think is really important that I'm recognizing kind of inhibits the first two things that we focused on, which is, bearing our burden, sacrifice, and accepting help, companionship along the road, is ultimately a willingness to engage with healing or responding to the wounds that we each receive in our respective lives. Now, what the heck do I mean by that, right? Like, okay, maybe you're like, okay, I kind of get the first two things, but this, I don't exactly get this. Well, what I'm trying to get at here is that one thing that we also see in Frodo's masculinity is that it requires a lot of healing. Whenever he gets, after bearing the ring to Rivendell, he has to spend a good amount of time in Rivendell in order to experience healing, in order for him to be able to be rejuvenated, to carry the ring once again, right? So he has to have physical healing. But then we see, even with, again, the time of rest that the Fellowship has in Lothlorien, that there, in many ways, their hearts are being mended. So they've just lost Gandalf. They're kind of at a loss of what comes next. But they've gotten the ring that far. And so the difficulty at that moment becomes not so much, doesn't become so much of, like just simply rest, but also that they need to mend the hearts and the difficulties that they're experiencing in order for Frodo to be able to continue carrying his burden, he needs that time of rest, that time of healing, to be able to better understand what comes next, to be able to better carry the burden in the future. And so, and then even after, they get all the way, even their short reprieve with Faramir is very important in the book. Like in the book, unlike the movie that paints Faramir and the entire interaction as kind of a negative one, in the book, it's actually a rather important reprieve for both Frodo and Sam. That they're both hardened by Faramir's example of humility, because he isn't tempted by the ring in the same way that he is in the same way that he is in the movie. But then even afterwards, we see that then Frodo takes a lot of time to heal. He has to, and even at the end of the day, he can't receive enough healing in this world that he has to go on to, over the sea, to the undying lands in order to receive that healing. And why I think that is important for us as men to recognize is one, we do need to take our rest. Sunday can oftentimes just turn into another day for us to get chores done and do a lot of other stuff. And while it can be relaxing if you have a hobby of doing woodworking or something like that, and that could be a fine thing to do on a Sunday, I do think that there's also a necessity for us as men to take that step back, because we need to receive healing and some time for us to prioritize family, friends, and to take the time for the Lord to really treat our hearts as he wants to do in personal prayer. But I think also along with that is the thing that I also want to emphasize there is healing is also the way that we respond to the wounds and the traumas that we experience. And the sinfulness that we experience in others that maybe hurts us. Because ultimately Frodo is he is so broken again that he has to go to the Undying Lands. But what ultimately his difficulties, his peril, the way he was betrayed by Boromir, Gollum, the intense burden that he had, by all rights, he should have never had to carry it, right? That's what Gandalf's famous line is, by rights, he shouldn't be there. He shouldn't have to bear that responsibility. And I think a difficulty that we can experience as men is that can develop into bitterness. Why do I have to bear this burden? What I think is so heroic about the way that Frodo responds is that it says that in the book, and this is even shown because whenever the hobbits get back to the Shire, it's actually been taken over by a very weakened form of Saruman and Wormtongue, and some rather treacherous hobbits who are, and ruffians, men, who have taken over the Shire, and they have to win it back. And throughout the battle that ensues and the fight that ensues, what we see happen is that Frodo again and again is the one who is encouraging mercy, that he's encouraging the hobbits to not respond with vengeance or cruelty, but to be merciful even to those who were showing them cruelty and vengeance and vindictiveness. And what I think is so powerful about that is this is a good lesson for us as men too. We shouldn't allow the wounds and the traumas that we experienced, whether all the way from our childhood up to the present moment, to cause us to become hard-hearted, to cause us to become difficult, to cause us to ultimately grow bitter. And I think what we all, as men, should be willing to embrace is that we need to experience healing. And healing comes with time through having good relationships. Healing is ultimately a process. It's not something, I think Sister Miriam made a comment at a retreat I was on at the beginning of November that oftentimes has been we can treat kind of the process of overcoming our wounds and our brokenness as a seek and destroy mission. What's wrong? What do I need to destroy? And I'll destroy it, right? But oftentimes what healing has to be is, as men, and this is hard for us to accept, is something that takes time. We have to learn to take our rest to process it, that we have to learn to bring the difficulties, the wounds we have to the Lord, we have to be willing to be vulnerable with people that we can trust. As I mentioned in the second thing, like that's a key to healing. And that's ultimately takes time, it takes difficulty, and it takes work. But it's absolutely necessary, because otherwise, bearing our burdens freely and our ability to accept help in carrying those burdens, and thus making those burdens more meaningful, making those burdens easier to carry, isn't going to happen. We're going to become more and more isolated, and we're going to become more and more bitter. So without this last one, without continually working on this, we can't move forward, because we need to be willing to accept life as it is. We need to be willing to accept reality. We need to be willing to accept what God has given us. As a priest, that means I need to be willing to bear the responsibilities of the particular assignment I am in. But I also need to be willing to accept the help that is given to me, and I need to be willing to ask for help. And then for the married man, this means that he needs to be willing to accept that his wife is the one whom God wanted him to marry. He needs to accept that he is called to be a father to his children, and as perfect as he may be, that he still needs to be involved in the life of his family. He also needs to accept that he needs to do his job. He needs to provide for his family, that he needs to be there in order to help them to grow, but also be willing to go upon his own kind of, not adventure in the normal sense, but he needs to be willing to do his work and do his job well in order to provide for them well. And so that means bearing that burden and accepting the help of your wife and finding good male friends to aid you in your role as a husband, as a father, and working with your wife in order to raise your children in the faith, in order to raise them to love Jesus, in order to raise them to love the church, and in order to raise them to carry their own burdens. And then I think even for those who are single, that something I can see, and this is where I'll end. So this one's getting long, but that's okay. I knew that my videos would start probably being longer. And I think part of what, as men, we also need to learn, or something that I can see happen for men who are especially single, is that there can kind of, that one can settle into this sort of sweet sadness, or can simply let off the gas, right? Like, my life isn't turning out how I wanted it, or I don't think this is time to start dating. And so we just simply, and I can just see men kind of like gliding through life and just hoping that at some point they're going to meet somebody, or at some point God will reveal to them that they're called to the priesthood or whatever. But I want to challenge men that are in that situation is, you still have a responsibility. You still have a burden to carry. You still have a sacrifice to make. And that may be to your parish. That may be to your family at large as an uncle, as a son. That may be to your community. That may be to your job, right? Like, doing good work is going to be of help to the other employees there. You are going to make it possible for men who are married. You are going to make it possible for them to be able to provide for their family by being a better employee yourself. And so I think in all of these things, what I really want to encourage is that we each can take responsibility each day for what the task that lies before us. As difficult as it may be, as hard as it may be to accept, that God does have a task for each man. He has a task for each woman too. And so this also applies to women, I think, to a certain extent too, but I think I'm speaking to men because I feel that there is something lacking here, and that this is the basis of our manhood, is ultimately a sort of Frodo-esque manhood, a willingness to carry the burdens that have been laid upon us, perhaps that we embrace naively, but now even if they've grown difficult and heavy, that we can freely choose to carry them. And as we freely choose that, we need to also freely be willing to accept help, to ask for help from those around us. And so I hope that was helpful. Again, appreciate feedback in the comments on this. Like, subscribe, all that stuff that YouTubers say, yay. And with that, hopefully in a couple weeks, I'll be back with a video, I believe, about, we'll focus on Aragorn, because I feel like that's probably the next logical step to take, and Aragorn and masculinity. So I hope you all have a blessed day, have a blessed week, and we'll see you soon.